A band of Native Americans on the trail, forlorn, beaten down, together, yet as one looks at them, each one seems to be locked in a private darkness, a solitude that seems to admit no other persons. Certain things seem symbolic. There seems no touch of color in any clothing, only a dull gray, a color suggesting despair. The moon tells us this scene is at night. The falling snow tells us it is in winter. Night and winter, symbolic seasons suggesting the end of life, despair, death. In fact, this is a painting of the Native Americans making their last journey, a journey from the ancient land of their ancestors to a new home, a reservation set aside for them by the U.S. government. The year 1836. A few hundred miles north at Concord, Massachusetts, a new spiritual awakening is occurring. Ralph Waldo Emerson published Nature the same year. Utopian communities like Brook Farm were in the wind. Abolition was a real movement. And in 3 more decades, African Americans will be emancipated. But here, somewhere in the forests of the southern Mississippi, these Native Americans take their last walk on the Cherokee Trail of Tears to a place called Indian Territory, set aside for them, the state of Oklahoma. Lands set aside for their perpetual use because they were of no use to the white man. Yet even here, eternity would be short-lived. In 70 years, Oklahoma, too, would be overrun, and the Native Americans would be pushed still further west. Welcome to English 3350, a survey of American literature before the Civil War. We're in Studio 3 at the M.D. Anderson Library on the main campus of the University of Houston. I'm Barry Wood, and today we're looking at a century of Native American voices from the time of the French and Indian War in the 1750s up until the end of this course with the Civil War. We begin with the Iroquois. This is their sacred wampum band signifying their 5 nations, with the 6th actually, another group joined, and signifying their agreement with the American government. Powerful federation of tribes across the southern coast or shore of Lake Ontario. A federation, I'd like to remind you, that predated the coming of Columbus, and at the moment we begin this story, in the 1750s, this Iroquois Federation is already 300 years old. Older, we might add, than present-day America is, dating from the Declaration of Independence. These are the tribes. You'll recall this map: the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, and the Mohawk tribes, scattered across really from the Buffalo region right across below Rochester through Syracuse and well up into upstate New York, and extending all the way to the Canadian border, which would run up the St. Lawrence right here. Now, perhaps we need to look at a chronology of events here, of things that we're going to be looking at in this class. The French and Indian War was really the 7 Years' War everywhere else in the world. In fact, the 7 Years' War has been called the First World War because it was fought not only in Europe but also in the Indian Ocean, in Asia. In America, the French and Indian War was the final showdown between the British and the French. And you'll recall that the French penetrated the entire St. Lawrence area all the way through the Great Lakes and then down the Mississippi to the Caribbean, to the Gulf of Mexico. And so, in a sense, the French had the English hemmed in. Now, when the English finally defeated the French, what they did was they pushed them right out of the Mississippi Valley and out of the Great Lakes area and all the way back to what is now the Canadian province of Quebec. Just to quickly look at another map here. The American colonies are down here, and up here these are the Great Lakes, and the Canadian border really follows the Great Lakes here. This is the border between Ontario, which is English-speaking, and Quebec. The French were, in a sense, swept out of the whole interior of the continent and back to that line, which is running from the St. Lawrence up as the Ottawa River, border between English-speaking Ontario and French-speaking Quebec. Now, let's look at this chronology again. The French and Indian War was such an expensive war for the British. Keep in mind that this is before the American colonies exist, so the English are prosecuting this war, and of course their headquarters is England. And here they are trying to deal with wars in the interior of the American continent. And having spent 7 years and drained enormous resources in defeating the French, they are anxious to prevent any more difficulty in the interior. And so in 1763, they established a royal proclamation line. Now, we'll come back to this chronology in a second, but looking at the map again, here are the American colonies running up the coast. You can pick them out: New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont and Maine. I'm sorry, New Hampshire and Maine. And you'll see that this proclamation line runs right down actually the crest of the mountains. And that proclamation line of 1763 was a line over which the American colonists were told they should not go. They were not authorized to go over the mountains and settle in this country. And one of the reasons was that the Iroquois Confederacy still occupied these lands. Now, the Iroquois fought with the British, or originally were aligned with the British. But when the British split into British loyalists loyal to England and rebels fighting against them, then the Iroquois were caught in a sandwich, and they actually fought with the British, and that left them with these American rebels more or less on the enemy list now. And there was a great deal of hostility that had not been there for the previous couple of centuries, but now there was hostility between the Iroquois along here, the Senecas all the way up to the Mohawks, and the American colonies. So this proclamation line was designed to eliminate hostilities, keep the colonists to the east, and not stir up trouble in the interior. And of course, the Confederacy here is only one group. I mean, this whole interior of the continent is filled with scores of other tribes. We've just singled out the Iroquois Federation here for discussion. Now, to go back to our chronology, within just 13 years, in 1776, we then have the Revolutionary War. Well, actually, I jumped the gun in talking about the hostility. Actually, the British were friendly with the Iroquois for those 13 years, and didn't really want incursion into their territory. But once the Revolutionary War came then in 1776, that's when the problems began to develop, because the Iroquois took the side of the British and fought against the rebels. So you do have a severe problem now. However, because the the rebels, now having kicked the British out, they don't want to honor any of the agreements that had been established, and so they dismantled the 1763 proclamation line and decided to wade into this territory and settle. And to that degree, the year after the Revolutionary War was over, they penetrated up into Iroquois country and signed the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, in which they took away most of the Iroquois lands and assigned it to the American colonies. And in again, to look at the map, in 1784 they signed the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, which is right up here. It'd take a lot of this land, but the next year the Northwest Ordinance is signed, and that calls for the beginning of the Survey of the West. And that ordinance actually started right here at on the Pennsylvania border at Ohio, right about there. That's where the survey of the western lands began. That was where the base point was set for surveys of lands to the west. So you can see that with this Fort Stanwix agreement in Iroquois territory, and then the beginning of the surveys over here in other Indian territories, you have an incursion all along this front that is going to create a good deal of disruption. So that's the Northwest Ordinance of 1785, which establishes that a survey will begin. Then, of course, you have the Constitution and the War of 1812, but you've got continual tension building up through this period, through this 20, 30-year period, and troubles all along the other side of the Appalachians, wherever settlers are moving over the mountains into Ohio, into Kentucky, into Tennessee, into Alabama and Mississippi and so on. You have severe difficulties with the Native Americans, and finally in 1831 the Indian Removal Law was passed, and this called for the removal of all Indians in the southern states, moving them west of the Mississippi, and what is now the state of Oklahoma, but not just Oklahoma, also parts of Arkansas and Kansas, all west of the Mississippi, were set aside and designated as Indian Territory. They were incidentally regarded as part of what was called the Great American Desert, those states. Geographers now refer to those areas as the short grass prairie, as opposed to the long grass prairie that's close to the Mississippi. The short grass prairie was very poor grazing land, and when these Native Americans were pushed west, it was thought that the Americans would never ever want this land, and so it was a good place to put the Native Americans. And so they were then forced to move in the 1830s, and of course they were resistant through the early 1830s. Finally, in 1836, they were forced. The last of the Cherokees were forced to move west, and that's the famous Trail of Tears, which we'll refer to a little later. Now, to start with, we're going to look at then the Native American voices in the Iroquois Confederacy. The tensions here are fairly simple in the period right after the Revolutionary War. As I say, the Iroquois had fought for the British. When the rebels defeated the British, that put the Iroquois in a kind of enemy position, and in 1784, a treaty at Fort Stanwix was signed. It was more or less forced on the Iroquois by the rebels, and it created a kind of fiction, an American fiction, that in fact the defeat of the French had also been the defeat of the Iroquois, and so the American colonists then came in aggressively, dropped all diplomatic niceties, including terms like Iroquois nation and brothers, and the treaty that they forced upon the Iroquois then took most of western Pennsylvania, this area here, most of western New York State, which would be this area here where the Senecas had historically lived, and it also took large portions of Ohio down here. This was getting ready for the survey that began at this point, but it also, these peoples, while not part of the Iroquois Confederacy, were closely allied to the Iroquois Confederacy, and Native American tribes here looked to the Iroquois as a kind of buffer between them and the American colonists. So and then having signed these treaties and taken most of these lands here in Pennsylvania, New York, and Ohio, they then gave, and I suggest the word is in quotation marks, they gave the Iroquois a few scraps of land, gave it as if it was not already Iroquois land, and gave it as if it ever was colonial land to give away. Meanwhile, because the proclamation line was thrown out once the British were defeated, thousands of settlers began to pour over the mountains into this area, and this led to all kinds of bloody skirmishes all along this border in the 1780s and 1770s and 1780s. In 1790, the Seneca chief, Cornplanter, went to Philadelphia, which was at that time the U.S. capital. His speech is printed up in our Native American documents packet, beginning on page 15. And what was a speech then also became a letter to President Washington. You have actually three Native Americans as authors of that letter: Big Tree, Cornplanter, and Halftown. They're all Senecas, of course, because their land was the most affected. But it's Big Tree, it's Cornplanter who actually took the lead. And he, first of all, tries to deal with the confusion because of the American Revolutionary War. These Native Americans typically address the president as Father. Father, when you kindled your 13 fires separately, that means the 13 colonies before they had declared independence, and before they had created a constitution in 1787. Remember, this is 3 years after the Constitution. When you kindled your 13 fires separately, you told us that you were all brothers, the children of one great Father who regarded the red people as his children, who resided beyond the great water, a king whose power no people could resist. So they told him about King George, and all men were brothers under King George III. We promised to obey him. What the Seneca nation promises, they faithfully perform. When you refused obedience to that king, in other words, when the rebels decided to go against King George and declare independence, he, that is the king, commanded us to assist his beloved men in making you sober. That is, the king asked the Iroquois to assist the British in putting down the rebels. In obeying him, we did no more than yourselves had led us to promise. We were deceived, but your people teaching us to confide in that king had helped to deceive us, and we now appeal. Is all the blame ours? Father, again addressed to George Washington, the king, or the president. Father, when we saw that we had been deceived and heard the invitation which you gave us to draw near to the fire you had kindled and talk with you concerning peace, we made haste. You told us you could crush us to nothing, and you demanded from us a great country. This is referring to the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1784, by which the Senecas lost most of their land. You demanded from us a great country, as if our want of strength had destroyed our rights. Keep in mind that these Native Americans are not stupid. Many of them have got an education. Cornplanter was one of the brightest of these Native Americans of his era, very, very well educated, knew his American history. And when he says destroyed our rights, he is very, very conscious of the rights of equality and so on that are established by the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. We're just a year off the Bill of Rights, which came the next year in 1791, but other states had already talked about rights of people, so Cornplanter is very much aware of this. Were the terms dictated to us reasonable and just? In other words, the terms of that Fort Stanwix Treaty by which you took all our lands. And then, of course, he makes the most telling point, which we've made in this course a number of times. All the land we have been speaking of belonged to the Six Nations. No part of it ever belonged to the King of England, and he could not give it to you. And if you recall, that's precisely the argument way back in colonial times that Roger Williams made. Remember, he was the legal mind in the colonies who said it's not the King of England's to give out to the colonists because it's never been deeded over by the Indians to the King of England. And when he set up his own rebel colony at Providence, Rhode Island, that's the first thing he did, is sit down with the Indians and establish legal deeds to the land so that he had actual title to the land rather than just taking it. Well, Chief Cornplanter, as you could see, is a pretty direct, pretty pointed man. And there, of course, there was never any acknowledgement out of Washington or out of the Congress of just how correct the Iroquois were in their dissatisfaction. They were well justified in how they felt. Meanwhile, to the west, in Ohio, the Shawnees, the Delawares, and the Miamis find themselves victims of settlers coming in, of the surveys beginning in 1785. They formed a Western Confederacy, somewhat similar to the Iroquois Confederacy, and in fact it enacted some really crushing defeats in 1790 and 1791 on the American Army. In fact, 2/3 of the American Army was lost in two battles in 1790 and 1791. But it took several more visitations by the Iroquois chiefs to Washington and more wars before Congress adopted real conciliation and were willing to renegotiate the hated Treaty of Fort Stanwix. During this period, another very powerful chief, Red Jacket, emerged during the heated times of the 1790s. And he had been born about 1750 and had actually fought with the Iroquois and with the French against the English. He was just scarcely out of his teenage years when he fought. And now in his 40s, in the 1790s, he emerged as one of the most intellectually rigorous of all the Iroquois chieftains. You need to keep in mind, I think, that what the educated Iroquois absorbed from British and American culture was being absorbed during the Enlightenment. And so they often are very enlightened in their approach to things with a very rigorous logic, and I mean, they can debate and argue important issues as well as any of the Americans. Red Jacket had an unflinching determination. He was rigorously firm in purpose. He had great moral courage, and he was a very powerful orator. He was not afraid to confront Americans. He was not afraid to stand before Congress and speak on behalf of the Iroquois and speak his mind. His speeches were riveting. His Indian name, his Seneca name, Sagoyewatha, means he keeps them awake, which I think is a reference to his oratorical power. No one was likely to fall asleep when he was at the podium. And he was not personally impressed with any aspect of American culture or civilization. He always defended the traditional ways of the Iroquois, and especially the right to follow their own ways. Now, Red Jacket gave a goodly number of political speeches in the 1790s, and he was so influential, in fact, that a biography was written by him in the 19th century. One example that is important, and it is included in the Native American documents packet that I distributed for this course. It was actually read in a previous class. I want to mention it now. That's his speech in response to missionary efforts in 1805, and this deals with Christianity. There were really three aggressive policies that affected the Native Americans, and we've been looking at two of them. One, of course, is the exertion of American political power to seize sovereignty over the Native Americans. Another is the settlement and seizure of Indian lands, backed up, of course, by the American Army. The third was the missionary thrust to convert Native Americans to Christianity. Now, this has been an ongoing thrust through American history. We'll recall, if we go all the way back to Spanish-American times, we have Spanish virtually destroying Aztec religion and supplanting it with Catholicism. In French Canada, we had the Jesuits going in and dealing with the Huron Indians. Similar missionary efforts were happening all up and down the American coastline. And always the record shows that missionaries came in with an intense cultural superiority. They denigrated the native religion, they exalted their own, and they believed that giving Christianity to Native Americans, while was important, while they systematically destroyed the indigenous religion, and they believed that this was the morally correct thing to do. Now, from an anthropological and cultural point of view, no missionary effort can be morally justified. It is a severe disruption of a culture. It is as disruptive as coming in and establishing new marital patterns, new political systems, new educational systems, new art traditions, new literary traditions. Any of these things imposed upon a people one would recognize as culturally immoral. And the same can be said, of course, of missionary efforts, whether they be Christian or any other religion. It's an aspect of culture that people deserve to have. And any other approach is a narrow, very narrow cultural perspective. It's really just another version of standard in-group, out-group behavior disguised as spirituality. In New York, the focus of the missionaries was in upstate New York in Iroquois territory at the end of the 18th century. Here, Lutherans and Methodists and Presbyterians had pressed in. Few had had any success at all in dislodging the Native American religion. In 1805, an evangelical preacher moved in and called all the Seneca chiefs together at Buffalo and began proselytizing. Somehow he thought that he might have more success than other missionaries. And we have here a sampling of what he said in that in his proselytizing. Brothers, notice the patronizing use of the same language that the Native Americans use when they address white. Brothers, I have not come to get your lands, but to enlighten your minds. That kind of condescension, of course, just made the Native Americans furious. There is but one religion. Now, he makes a basic assumption in approaching these Iroquois, a convenient assumption, hoping that this will help to convert them, that really they worship the same God as Christians. They call that God the Great Spirit. But then you see what he says, you have never worshipped the Great Spirit in a manner acceptable to him, but have all your lives been in great error and darkness. So this is a kind of it's very common sort of missionary stance in early times that we have the superior religion, all other religions are pagan, they have dim apprehension of the truth. They may worship a god or a spirit, and he's really the Christian God, but they don't recognize it as such, and they need to be taught how to raise their approach to their God up to a civilized level. Well, with that, Chief Red Jacket, you can see he's a thin, sort of wiry man. He rose and delivered the speech, which is included in the packet on page 12, the speech in response to missionary efforts in 1805. And he began by rehearsing the history, how the Native Americans once owned all this land from sea to sea, but the white man had brought evil. He came here to worship freely, the white man had, but then and the Native Americans accommodated him in friendly terms. But what were the results? The white man gave them poison, referring of course to liquor, took their land and destroyed their villages. Brother, you have now become a great people. He's speaking to this missionary. You have now become a great people, and we have scarcely a place left to spread our blankets. You have got our country, but are not satisfied. You want to force your religion upon us. These are some of the most telling remarks, I believe, ever spoken against Christianity as a missionary effort. Brother, you say that you are right and we are lost. How do we know this to be true? We understand that your religion is written in a book. If it was intended for us as well as for you, why has not the Great Spirit given to our forefathers the knowledge of that book with the means of understanding it rightly? This, incidentally, people today are not as conversant with theology as they used to be, but what he's dealing with is what has traditionally in theology been called the scandal of Christianity, the belief that God chose one people to dispense his revelation for all mankind, and then gave that people the burden of extending that to all other people. That has theologically been described as the scandal of Christianity, and here Red Jacket puts it in very succinct terms. Why hasn't the Great Spirit given to us? I mean, they've acknowledged, the missionaries have acknowledged that the Great Spirit and the Christian God are the same God. Why did he just give it to the white people? Why didn't he give it also to the red people? And then he goes on to say, since the Great Spirit has not given to us knowledge of this, as he says here, we only know what you tell us about it. How shall we know when to believe, being so often deceived by the white people? And they had been, of course, over the land and treaties and so on. Brother, and here's another telling criticism. I mean, it attacks Christianity right at the center. Brother, you say there is but one way to worship and serve the Great Spirit. If there is but one religion, why do you white people differ so much about it? Why not all agree, as you can all read the book? Just such a beautifully succinct statement addressing the problem of Protestant fragmentation into what by then had become scores of sects. Well, you can see that Red Jacket was probably not a popular Native American chief with the Americans, yet his words stand out today really as some of the most powerful that we can find addressing the whole missionary effort. Well, now we turn to the Ojibwe Indians, and particularly to Jane Johnston, Schoolcraft, her married name Schoolcraft, who she is from. She grew up in this area. We're further north now. She's actually the daughter of a chieftain. Here's the Ojibways, and this was the area where she met her husband, and then they relocated at the Sioux, which is Sault Ste. Marie over here. And he was an explorer. John Johnston, her husband, was an explorer who was interested in Native American ways, and so she introduced him to the Ojibwe people, her people here, and he wrote about 20 books and some scores of articles on he was a scholar on Native American ways. And she is one example of one of the first literary people who is fully conversant in two cultures, her own tribal culture, the Ojibwe, plus an English American culture. And she herself is a product of a mixed marriage. She's aware of the value of her own tribal root. Her father was John Johnston. He was an Irish fur trader, and her mother was the daughter of an Ojibwe chieftains. So she's fully conversant with these two cultures and very much aware of her own tribal roots, and she's a preserver of her culture, and she wrote up a good number of stories and lore from the Ojibwe. Now, before we look at her, let's review some basic things that have go all the way back to the beginning of this course. We've talked about the three uses of language: the labeling use, to label a reality which is present to the speaker, as when you say, this is a book, or I am sitting at a desk, or I am watching the television set. Secondly, the referential use of language, to refer to a world which was once present to the speaker, as, for example, if you describe what you did yesterday or where you went yesterday, the reality of where you walked or drove yesterday is not present to you. You're referring to it using standard dictionary words. The third use of language is the imaginative, and that is to create an imaginative, that is a not real and not factual world, an invented separate reality. And of course, all literature depends on that particular use of language. We're most familiar with the imaginative use of language in fiction, in novels and so on that we might buy, but this also is basic to belief among early peoples, and certainly the Native Americans. Beyond the imaginative use of language, then we have this progress of belief in which first imaginative words are seen as referential. That is, a separate reality is described in early stories, but those who tell those stories make no distinction between what is real and what is referential. Thus, while we look at, let's say, the stories of the Greek gods as imaginative, because we're not committed to those stories, religiously committed, the early Greeks regarded these as referential. In other words, a description of the gods and what they said and what they did on Mount Olympus was a referential description. So once imaginative words are seen as referential, then the separate reality that those imaginative words create is seen as real, factual, and truly existing. And when an entire culture then adopts the same separate reality as real, factual, and true as actually existing, the result then is a mythology. Now, in mythology, this would apply to almost all mythologies. The separate reality includes usually two separate realms. One is sort of scattered around this earth. That's a sort of lower separate reality. The other is above and beyond this earth. Let's talk about the first one first, the reality that is above and beyond this world that we find in myth. This is a supernatural realm of beings of immense power, which are of two kinds, good and bad. And they consist principally of gods, goddesses, and evil deities or devils. And of course, we could illustrate this. From Greek mythology, Hindu mythology, Native American mythology, the early Old Testament, and so on. A supernatural realm of beings that are in power far above human power. Then below that there is what we could call a magical realm of spirits, angels, magicians, wizards, demons, gremlins, magic animals, talismans, charms, and magic objects. And you'll recognize a lot of these things. This is the realm where witchcraft is located. This is the realm where Tolkien's Lord of the Ring is located with the magic ring that he's lost, Frodo. And this is also the area where a lot of Greek myths occur, where you have talking animals, where you have changes between humans and animals and so on. This is the separate reality of myth. It's an imaginative reality. Now, we have in this, on our list of readings, this story called Mishosha, or the Magician and His Daughters. And this is a beautiful example of ordinary story and myth. The story begins as an ordinary story. An Indian, his wife, and 2 children. There's a love triangle. The woman falls in love with a young man that she meets, and she goes off and meets him. The husband finds out and leaves her. So in a sense, you've got a societal no-no here, with both the wife leaving and the husband leaving. And what have you got left? You've got 2 abandoned children. So we have an ordinary love triangle here with abandoned children. And it's interesting because it reveals 2 things, that even in traditional society, romantic love could on occasion disrupt family life, and children could be abandoned by parents. In any case, this story is quickly left behind. The 2 boys, the parents are completely forgotten in the story. We never get back to them. We follow the stories, and immediately we find ourselves moving into a realm of myth. The boys are down by the water. The older son is in the water. Suddenly a canoe comes by with lightning speed, and Mishosha snatches up the older boy and takes him away. And we now find ourselves in a magical realm, a mythic realm. Mishosha is a magician. Islands are enchanted. The canoe is magical. Slap its side, for instance, and it moves with no time at all to where you want to go. This is a completely magical world. The gulls obey the magician. The fish obey the magician. The eagles obey the magician. There are 4 attempts to destroy the boy, and he emerges as a kind of hero. The magician is apparently evil. He collects victims as if he is looking for husbands for his daughters, but in fact he's just an evil wizard sort of collecting victims. The story becomes a test of survival for the older son. Time after time he outwits the magician. It also becomes a challenge. How can he rescue his younger brother? Finally he does. And in this, it becomes a kind of heroic story where where the victor gains his reward. In this case, he manages to rescue his younger brother from the beach where he was left, and bring him to this island. And then the evil wizard's 2 daughters are conveniently there, and so we have a double marriage. And then they return to the mainland, which is a kind of a symbolic moving out of the realm of magic back into the real world of the Native Americans. And the marriages of their sons, of the sons here, are stable and apparently long-lasting, in contrast to the marriage of the parents, which was quite unstable. Remember, the mother had run away with a lover, and the father had not been loyal enough to stay with his children. So, like all myths, this story perhaps portrays deep-seated fears, wayward love. The true values, of course, rest in stable love. Now, another little literary piece that is told by Schoolcraft is far less mythic. It takes place in an ordinary referential world, with the death of a father and the death of a mother, when the father dies, he asks his two older children to look after the third younger child, and they swear that they will. The mother dies shortly, and this is really in the ordinary world. The only mythic portion of this story is at the very end, where the young boy turns into a wolf. In one sense, this story is a kind of mirror of the former story. In the former story, the parents were irresponsible. In this case, the parents are responsible, but it's the older of their children that are not responsible, who don't look after the younger child. They, in fact, abandon their brother. And again, the story captures very deep feelings of a culture. Clearly, the need for a kind of brotherly, sisterly devotion is very important. The importance not only of parental devotion, but the irresponsibility of self-centered behavior that leads to this problem. The mythic dimension comes in when the boy is abandoned to a kind of state of nature or pure survival, when we see him grubbing for roots, eating the refuse of wolves, and then, of course, he, at the end of the story, turns into a wolf. And that, of course, is meant to be a symbolic transformation. The changing of humans into animals is, as a visible symbol, is a very common theme. If you go all the way back to the Greek Odysseus, for instance, you find Odysseus's men becoming greedy for food. They eat too much and turn into pigs. In Ovid's Roman mythology, in the Metamorphoses, people regularly turn into animals appropriate to their behavior. In the old French fairy tale, The Beauty and the Beast is apparently a man who has been turned into a beast, and he is only rescued, as you know, when Beauty says she loves him in that form, and then he turns back into a man. And of course, you've got the story of the Frog Prince, too. So transformations between animals and human beings for symbolic purposes is a very common theme. Well, now, of course, in this early period in the 19th century, you did have cooperative efforts between the Native Americans and the whites. Here we have pictured part of the great exploration edition, the Lewis and Clark expedition that was chartered by Jefferson, where Lewis and Clark penetrated far to the west, all the way to the west coast, the first white people to do so, much aided by the Native Americans, including that amazing woman Sacagawea, who guided them all the way. But crisis is certainly near, deep in the southern, the country of the so-called five civilized tribes, including the Cherokees and the Choctaws, the Chickasees, the Creeks, and the Seminoles. Crisis begins to build up among these people. Let's get a look at where they're located. Here we've got the Atlantic coast down here. This is North Carolina here, and you could see the states ringed around here. The Cherokee nation, as it existed in these early decades of the 19th century, occupied, as we can see, all of the state of Kentucky, a little bit of West Virginia, a little bit of Virginia, the western end of North Carolina, and this part of South Carolina, northern Georgia, northern Alabama. This is a Cherokee nation. They are, of course, one of the five civilized tribes who occupy this whole area. The Choctaw group is one of those other five tribes. Here's Texas over here, and here's Oklahoma, which has been designated as Indian Territory. The Mississippi River runs right down here. We have represented in the anthology a piece by Elias Boudinot, and he is an example of a Native American tragedy. Born Cherokee, given a white man's education at Cornwall in Connecticut, a good education. He married a white American, and he delivered his address to the whites on a number of occasions, which is printed in the anthology. He edited a newspaper called the Cherokee Phoenix, and he was instrumental in getting the New Testament translated into Cherokee. But in 1828, the harassment of the Cherokees began when gold was discovered in their lands. If we look on this map again, gold was discovered in northern Georgia, particularly, but also in other places too in this area of the Cherokee lands. And of course, greedy for gold, the white Americans wanted the land and found that the occupation of it by all these Cherokees was certainly in the way. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act was passed, which committed to the idea of moving a whole society of Indians west to Indian Territory over here, well beyond the Mississippi River. And Boudinot signed the treaty in 1835, too willingly it seems. He survived the Trail of Tears of 1836, but was later murdered out here in Indian Territory by his own people. And that's another thing that these removals did. It divided these Native American groups fiercely, because some decided not to leave, others did leave, and because of that different philosophical opinion, there grew to be a great conflict. His address to the whites is in very American terms. He gives the dimensions, the acreage of Cherokee land. He gives the population numbers. He specifies that there are 19,500 cattle, 6,100 horses, 19,600 swine, 22,000 other domestic beasts. There's sawmills, blacksmith shops. All of this, if you look at documents, the agricultural reports of the era, you recognize that this is standard white writing about territories to show the economic value of territories. What Boudinot was trying to do was show that the Cherokees had an economically viable people and land and geography, and therefore they were worth saving and promoting. But we can see that despite the facts and figures on what the Cherokee had accomplished, and indeed they were very friendly to the white Americans, it was all to no avail. The built-in prejudice, the racism at this time in the 1830s was just too great. White male Americans were not disposed to give equal rights to Native Americans any more than they were disposed to give equal rights to black Americans or white women. Well, the Choctaws. We have a piece in here by George W. Harkins. The Choctaws were prosperous Indians in Mississippi, and the Removal Act of 1830 called for their removal to lands west of the Mississippi, and the Choctaws then, according to the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, started their removal. They agreed to give up all their lands, and in midwinter of 1832, the Choctaws began their removal to the west. There were 13,000 Choctaws migrated from Mississippi, 13,000. 4,000 died on the way, nearly 25% from hunger, exposure, and disease. 7,000 who refused to move from Mississippi were legislated out of tribal existence. Cultural destruction. George Harkins voiced how the Choctaws felt to the American people in his farewell letter to the American peoples. We were hedged in by two evils, and we chose that which we thought least. The Choctaws, some decided to stay, some decided to go. He's decided to go west to Indian Territory. Yet we could not recognize the right that the state of Mississippi had assumed to legislate for us. A people so dissimilar in manners and customs as the Choctaws are to the Mississippians, we chose to suffer and be free. I could cheerfully hope that those of another age and generation may not feel the effects of those oppressive measures that have been so illiberally dealt out to us. Amid the gloom of the present separation, we are cheered with a hope that ere long we shall reach our destined home, and that nothing short of the basest acts of treachery will ever be able to wrest it from us, and that we may live free. The man who said he would plant a stake and draw a line around us that never should be passed was the first to say he could not guard the lines, and drew up the stake and wiped out all traces of the line. Now look at this next passage. I will not conceal my fears that the present grounds may also, I've inserted the word also for emphasis, may, and that's referring to the new Indian Territory where they're about to go. I will not conceal my fears that the present grounds may also be removed. I have my foreboding. Who of us can tell, after witnessing what has already been done, what the next force will be? And of course, he was exactly right. 70 years later, Oklahoma was opened up to settlers with a firing of the gun when a line of wagons tore into Oklahoma. If you want to see the film version of that, go and see Far and Away, where that is depicted in a wonderful scene at the end of that movie, historically accurate. And he goes on to say, painful in the extreme is the mandate of our expulsion. We regret that it should proceed from the mouth of our professed friend, and for whom our blood was commingled with that of his bravest warriors on the field of danger and death. That is referring to the fact that the Choctaws fought with General Jackson, later President Jackson, against the French. The Choctaws had been allies, and now this is the way they are treated. Well, the Trail of Tears, thousands were marched, thousands died. One of the most outrageous tragedies of American and Native American history. I don't have the exact figures in front of me for how many, but it's comparable to the Choctaw migration which had occurred 4 years earlier. The Trail of Tears, in other words, the Cherokee Trail of Tears was not the only one. There were 5 tribes. There were numerous trails, numerous marches in the 1830s. Tens of thousands of Native Americans were marched then to Oklahoma. And that it's arguable that this really was the end of these people, because where in history do you hear of these people again? They simply go out of existence. They sort of become assimilated. The generations die away. They become gradually assimilated into the general population, and eventually have no voice. Reduced, I suppose, finally to something like a hit parade song back in the 1970s, Cherokee Nation. Well, for our last person to look at in today's readings, we look at this wizened old man, Chief Seattle. We're all the way out to the west coast now. It's 1855. Chief Seattle is a chief of one of the Puget Sound Indian groups in the northwestern United States, up in Washington. And now that area of Oregon and Washington was opened up by the Oregon Trail after 1848, when the Oregon Trail really reached its peak. By 1855, the settlers were flooding into Oregon and Washington, very desirable country, no snow out there west of the mountains. And so now we've got people out there on the coast that are Native Americans who are in distress. Chief Seattle wrote one of the most famous of all statements by Native Americans. And he is here, of course, in 1855, referring to the presidential request for lands that the Americans would like to purchase, and in return, the Americans will give these Puget Indians a reservation to live on. And here is what he says. The great, and I presume good white chief, this is referring to the president, sends us word that he wishes to buy our lands, but is willing to allow us enough to live comfortably. This indeed appears just, even generous, for the red man no longer has rights that he need respect. And the offer may be wise also, as we are no longer in need of an extensive country. And if you read carefully, I think you can see there's a kind of low-key sarcasm running all through here. Chief Seattle objects to the language of brotherhood, that we are all brothers under one God. This is the Christian approach. And he objects to this rather fiercely. This speech actually is really the death knell speech of the American Indian. It is symbolically is goodbye, we are dying, we are going, and here's how we feel about it. Your God is not our God. Your God loves your people and hates mine. He folds his strong, protecting arms lovingly about the paleface and leads him by the hand as a father leads his infant son. But he has forsaken his red children, if they are really his. Through this speech, of course, Chief Seattle talks about how the bones of the ancestors of his people are plowed deeply into this soil. And of course, we know from the very beginning of this course, we know that the ancestors of the Native Americans came across Beringia somewhere in the neighborhood of 30,000 years ago. We know that these areas that are being talked about were inhabited after the Ice Age, after the ice had withdrawn. These areas were inhabited, the Washington area, southern Canada, Oregon, Montana. These were inhabited in a period of 15,000 years ago. So we're talking here about, we're seeing the words of a man who understands that this is the end of a tradition that goes on for centuries. he goes on to say, our God, the Great Spirit, seems also to have forsaken us. Your God makes your people wax strong every day. Soon they will fill all the land. Our people are ebbing away like a rapidly receding tide that will never return. The white man's God cannot love our people, or he would protect them. How then can we be brothers? How can your God become our God? If we have a common heavenly Father, he must be partial, for he came to his pale-faced children. We never saw him. He gave you laws that had no word for his red children, whose teeming multitudes once filled this vast continent as stars fill the firmament. No, we are two distinct races with separate origins and separate destinies. Of course, written all through this too is the fact that the spirits of the Indians, even though they are all die, will live on. They will walk among the white man. Chief Seattle does demand for his people that they be allowed always to visit their sacred places, that they can come off the reservation because the land is sacred to them. Your proposition seems fair, he says. I think my folks will retire to the reservation you offer them. It matters little where we pass the remnant of our days. They will not be many. The Indian's night promises to be dark. Not a single star of hope hovers above his horizon. Sad-voiced winds moan in the distance. Wherever he goes, he will hear the approaching footsteps of his destroyer. Very, very powerful, very, very traumatic. Chief Seattle's speech was actually reconstructed from notes taken at the time. We don't have an actual text, and there has been some confusion about this because 2 or 3 different texts do exist for this. This particular speech, of course, is in all its versions is one of the most powerful statements of the demise of the American Indian, and because of its very strong statement of ecological awareness, of the importance, the sacredness of all landscape, it has become in recent times a kind of centerpiece for the ecology movement. There is even a children's book, a very colorful children's book that uses part of it called, I think, Brother Sky, Sister Earth, with beautiful illustrations which excerpt a few sentences from it. Well, Chief Seattle stands at the end of this course just 10 years before the Civil War as a kind of death knell for the Native Americans. They won't go easily in the last half of the 19th century, really beyond the period of this course. There will be well over 100 major Indian wars fought west of the Mississippi as colonists move into Colorado and Wyoming and Utah and Arizona and Nevada and so on. Terrible, terrible battles. And so it will be at least another 50 years before the white Americans have taken it all away. But Chief Seattle, in a sense, foretells the end of the Native Americans in this 1855 speech. We are receding rapidly like a tide going out to sea. well. Have a good day.